So it's good to be back with you all. Today is a little bit of a different kind of presentation, learning lecture kind of thing. Rav Letty's asked me to review sort of the practical dimensions of doing a Jewish wedding. And so there's a lot to talk about. There's too much to talk about, to be honest, as you'll see. Like, weddings are like infinitely complex, and each little piece of it can be a total world of its own, both at a halachic level and on a practical level. So what I wanted to do, I have a detailed outline, like presentation that we'll look at, and I'll send it to you so you can use it as a reference going forward. But to try to touch on sort of the broad swath of all the details to convey, at least on some level, like what's involved when you're actually taking on the doing of a wedding. And again, one thing I'll keep in mind, I don't know how many of you will be in the position of doing weddings. I don't know how many weddings you'll do. So again, just look at this as an opportunity to like be exposed to a lot of things and recognize that it's not like if you like anything in life, right? Like hearing an hour YouTube on how to do X doesn't mean you then feel totally comfortable running out there to do X. So just, I would say, look, even though you've been learning the halacha all year, you know, weddings are one of those things where the halacha is certainly important, but like the practicality of it can overwhelm the halacha very, very quickly. So like, again, look at this as a way to get your feet wet and to be exposed to different things. And you know, as we go through it, feel free to ask questions.
Have you been introduced?
Briefly.
Okay. I trust this man. That's all I can say. And many others, I'm choking up. Many others have also. Okay, I'm sorry. Thank you for joining us.
One thing I will say, Rav Landis, is just to acknowledge the passing of Rav Aryeh Strakovsky, Zichron Livracha. Rav Aryeh was a very, very special person. I don't know how many people here got to know him. I'm sure Rav Landis. Actually, you know what, Rav Landis? I was going to say something, but I would like you to speak first if you'd like
to. He was a Gaon Olam in many, many areas. He looked like an ancient man, very physically fit. But he looked like an ancient man, but like our teacher, because we both had the Rav, our teacher often talked about Talmid Chacham being youthful, almost as a child in their innocence and their desire to play, except they played with learning and they played with ideas. And he never turned a student down for anything. So I will go from there. You will go on from there.
No, I agree with all of that. I'll just add that, again, like there were a few experiences like learning with Aryeh, like it's hard to describe. I think Rav Landis did a very good job capturing him. What I will say is that I didn't realize until for many years how spoiled I was to learn with Rav Aryeh and certainly Rav Landis as well, because Rav Aryeh embodied such a love of Torah that was natural, like and spontaneous and childlike in the best possible sense to me, to Mimut in the best possible sense. And when you're exposed to that, you can kind of take it for granted, right? Because, you just sort of think that's the way it should always be. And it took me a while to realize that most Talmidei Chachamim are not like that. Most Talmidei Chachamim don't have a love of Torah that is just open to everyone and infectious. And Rav Aryeh was absolutely unique that way. He loved Torah, like there's no other way to say. Kehem Chayin v'Arech Yameinu, we all like to think that, but for Rav Aryeh, it was 100% the case. And, I feel
Would I be out of line if I share one story about Rav Aryeh as well?
Please.
I'm sorry, and I don't want to eat into your time for the shiur tonight. I had the zechut of learning with him about 32 years ago when I was at Pardes. One of the stories I'd heard about him, which to me summed him up even more than a Talmid Chacham, was he would go every Shabbat afternoon. He lived in French Hill, so we would walk over to Har Tzofim and just do Bikur Cholim around the hospital. And there was one Shabbat, like late morning, he saw a woman who had gone into apparently false labor the day before. And she was very, very, very distraught about not being at home with her family. She apparently had like 3 very young kids and her husband, and she was really, really upset. And Rabbi said, I think you should go home because I worry about your unborn fetus here. The stress you're feeling is really a danger. And she wouldn't do it. And he said, what if I go with you? So we got in the cab, went with her. Apparently she lived about as far away from Har Sofim as you can live and still be inside Yerushalayim. But he went with her for Pikuach Nefesh. But of course, once she was out of the cabin at home, there's no more Pikuach Nefesh. So he had to walk back. And to me, that sums him up.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to share that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, so I'm gonna look to start, and Rav Landy should feel to jump in any and all times that you would like to. As I said, this is like there's a lot to cover here, and I will do my best to go through it. But again, as we're going through, feel free to ask questions, and we'll try to cover as best as we can. So Mazel Tov, it's your first wedding. So have any of you actually done a wedding? Maybe you have, maybe you haven't, I don't know. I see Joel's got his hand up. Anybody else? So, So again, like at some point, once people find out that you're a rabbi, right, you may very well be asked to do a wedding. Now, it's again, like my experience of doing weddings is almost exclusively in the role of being a synagogue rabbi, which I think is a bit different than might be the case for most of you if you're asked to do a wedding. So I'm gonna give this presentation assuming like you have a community and like you have an ongoing relationship with people that you might be doing weddings for, but that may not be the case for a lot of you, as you'll see. A lot of you, maybe the wedding might be something you kind of parachute in and out of. But regardless, we'll try to again look at sort of the full picture here of what's potentially involved in doing a wedding. So, and as I said, there's like a million pieces to it. I will just start out with a brief, word of halacha here. In your learning of Kedushin this year, you might have come across this statement towards the beginning of the Masechet, where it says, "Kol mi she'eno baki b'tiv gittin v'kedushin lo ya'asek imahem, lo rot bahem." Right? Anybody who's not an expert in the essence or the aspects of gittin and kedushin should not be engaged in them or issue rulings in them. Shebakal yachol litot v'yatir ta'erva v'grim laharbot mamzerim b'Yisrael, because it's easy in the context of marriage and divorce to make errors, to make mistakes. It is easy to make mistakes in these areas. I'll talk about that a little bit more. And to permit an erva, permit a forbidden sexual relationship, and to cause there to be more mamzerim in amongst the Jewish people. So this opening statement, "Kol mi she'eno baki b'tiv gittin v'kedushin lo ya'asek imahem lo rot bahem," right? Like this is actually like something you'll come across like a not insignificant amount of the time in halacha. And it's kind of true, right? If you don't really know what you're doing, you don't really know the halacha in these areas, you will probably make mistakes, and you will probably make big mistakes. Unfortunately, mistakes, even serious halachic mistakes, are quite common at weddings. And for a lot of rabbis who get up there and don't know what they're doing or don't do this very often, it is remarkably easy to really, screw things up. Now, I sort of come at this from a sort of a weird perspective, because in addition to having been a show rabbi and having done weddings, in my current role, working with the International Beit Din, which is all about helping free agunot, I spend most of my time thinking about how to get women out of marriages, right? Like hoping that there's things done wrong in the wedding that will make it easier for us to determine that she can get out of the marriage. So in a weird sense, like I kind of root for the mistakes now. But there's the flip side, which is that, as a rabbi, you're supposed to be doing this properly. And it's not so easy. And like I said, there are a lot of rabbis. I mean, we see a lot of cases, and there are a lot of rabbis who mess this up. A lot of Orthodox rabbis even who, I'm just talking like the basics they get wrong. Like, in terms of like, appointing obviously invalid adim or adim that are like related to each other. I mean, just like ridiculous things. And that's like the tip of the iceberg. So this is in Shulchan Aruch. So this is like, very established. We have to be careful about this. Not everybody should be engaged in such a thing. The Taz there actually points out that you don't have to be an expert in Kedushin and Gittin to at least be involved in Kedushin. Like you could still be a Masader Kedushin if you're not an expert in it, but you certainly should not be a Masader Gittin. And then the Pesach Tshuva there adds something else that's, very important, which is that maybe if you don't know what you're doing, you shouldn't be a Masadar Kedushin either. And there's just something to be said for that, right? That like, if you don't really know what you're doing, this may not be the kind of thing you just feel like, oh, I can get up there and wing it, right? If you take halacha seriously, if you take your role in this particular context seriously, it's not really the kind of thing you should just be like winging it, to say the least. I mean, I know Rav Landis takes this very seriously, and I remember him sharing with me, and maybe we even were in the car ride together, that there's a wonderful 2-volume set Nisuin Kehil Chatam, which is, you probably have seen it. And I remember Rav Landis saying to me on the way to the wedding that, like, when he's being driven over, like, he spends his time reviewing the halachas from the book, and again, that's like a good thing to do. Because the other thing that happens at weddings is like crazy things happen at weddings. So even if you think you know how to do like the wedding, but everything is done, everything's there for you, right? Like, well, very quickly you discover things aren't the way they're supposed to be. And you got to know how to handle that. If suddenly things have changed dramatically on you in terms of how the wedding is supposed to be done. So that's, I guess, a bit of a way of introduction. Take this seriously. Don't just go into this thinking you can be cavalier about this stuff. The other thing I'll say, and this comes from my experience as a shul rabbi, and again, I don't want to be overly cynical about this, but in my preparation for this, I was thinking about this verse from Kohelet. It's a verse you probably are familiar with, right? Tov lecha beit evel, el beit evel milechet el beit mishteh, b'asher hu sov kol ha'adam v'achai yitin el libo. So people are familiar with this verse. Like, so anybody want to offer a translation, interpretation of this verse for us? I see, what is it, Yavni or Rafael? Either one, feel free, just jump in. You just have to
Please,
unmute.
Rafael, go.
So basically, the pshat is that Bebet Evel in the house of mourning, like you can get an added bonus of like learning something about life and like becoming a better person by thinking about death. But like I know that's not the drash.
Okay, so the verse is saying it's better to go to a house of mourning than a Beit Mishta, which we'll presume is like a Sheva Brachos or a wedding or something like that, right? And then the end of the verse, Basher Sof Kol Adam V'Chayitenu Libo, is a little bit ambiguous, right? There's something about death or the experience of death or being there about death that is going to be significant. At the very least, I mean, the way the commentators explain it, there's a bunch of interpretations, but the basic answer is like going to a house of mourning puts life in perspective, gives you a sense of humility, right? And there's a moral religious value that comes out of that. Anybody else want to offer an interpretation of the verse? Why going to a house of mourning is better than going to, let's say, a wedding? Anyone? So look, there's another interpretation which says that a house of mourning is considered a better option because it's the last act of chesed you can do for a person who's died. Like once that's it, like this is your last chance. Whereas for the living person, like there'll be more opportunities, right? But this is the last one, so you better come and take it. It's another interpretation. So I want to add like a
I think also, who you tenant libo also I think is when you go to a Beit Evel, you're doing it from the heart. You're not gaining anything from it. It's pure giving. That's tenant libo.
Right. It could, well, I mean, Yiteno Libo here could just be some sort of like, intention, focus, or presence. But yes, right. There's something about it that has this added dimension that separates it apart. I just want to offer like a rabbinic interpretation. By rabbinic, I mean like synagogue rabbi interpretation to this. Maybe Rav Landis will disagree with me on this. I did like hundreds of funerals as my time as a rabbi, and I probably did like dozens of weddings. And I always enjoyed funerals more than weddings. Now, that's not because I'm a macabre person that enjoys death or something like that. But the rabbinic interpretation of this verse is that it's better to do a funeral than a wedding because funerals are much, much easier than weddings. They are like infinitely easier than weddings. Like your job, for two basic reasons. Number one, right, a successful funeral is just getting the body into the ground. That usually is not such a big deal. I have had funerals where I showed up and the wrong grave was dug. So that's a problem. And you can't just like dig another grave on your own. Like it's complicated. So we actually had to like leave and like come back a couple hours later. So sometimes it's hard to get people on the ground. But it's more or less straightforward. That's like number one with the funeral. And number two is like you're there to give a hesped, right? And people are actually there to listen to the hesped. Like they actually want to hear what the rabbi has to say at a funeral. Like the difference between a wedding is very stark. A wedding has like infinite pieces to it, as we're going to see. And to a large extent, nobody cares or remembers that the rabbi was even there, right? Like the successful rabbi at a wedding is the rabbi that like everybody kind of like has like smiles and be like, oh yeah, he did a nice job. And that's it. Nobody cares what you said, right? Like, and your job is ultimately just to make sure things run smoothly to a large extent. There are exceptions under rare circumstances.
I think what you're saying is absolutely true. Less cynically, I say the same thing, a little take off the cynicism. And the way to take it off to say the same thing you said, but to say, it's not about you.
Yeah.
You have rabbis, nobody ever comes to their shul, no one comes to their drushes. So once they're doing the wedding, they go overboard because they're actually talking about themselves. They tell stories about themselves. What's that got to do with it? So it's not about you.
I mean, look, in Israel especially, my God, in this country, nobody cares. Like once the rabbi starts opening his mouth, especially under the chuppah, it's kind of shocking. I mean, it's bad for both sides, to be honest. But it's just not the time and the place. I mean, there are ways to make weddings, like to have more of a meaningful moment at a wedding, right? Sometimes certain rabbis sing or they kind of facilitate certain moments, but it's not going to come because the rabbi opened his mouth and like inspired everybody. That's really not what you're there for. You're there primarily to make sure it runs smoothly and that everything happens the way that it's supposed to. So I want to break this down a little bit about sort of some of the major ideas, and then between sort of the preparation for the wedding and then the actual wedding itself. So let's start with the first sort of big question, right? Like a couple comes to you and they want to get married, they want you to officiate your wedding. And the question that comes up immediately is like, what exactly is your role in all this as the rabbi? So the first thing you have to keep in mind is that your role as the rabbi can vary tremendously depending on the wedding and the couple and the context. I have had weddings where I guess I technically officiated and had to do like barely anything. And I have had weddings in which I felt like I had to be involved in every detail. And also I spent like, meetings upon meetings with the couple beforehand, right? So it really, really varies tremendously. And a lot of your job, at least initially, is kind of assessing like, number one, like what is your role and like, what do you want your role to be and what can it be or what possibilities are there? Oftentimes they will have other clergy participating in the wedding. Oftentimes, like, there's just a lot of factors that are going on that will influence it, right? Is the wedding in your shul, or is this a destination wedding where you're traveling 3,000 miles to God knows where for like, 3 or 4 days, right? All of these things change the sort of the dynamics of this. And, again, when you get asked, recognizing that things can vary tremendously as to what your role can be, right? The first other detail you just have to keep in mind with this, unless you're a synagogue rabbi and they're members of your shul, but even in that context, just because somebody asks you doesn't mean you have to say yes, right? Unlike funerals where like people expect like their rabbi to do it, with weddings, like people know that like conflicts come up, people aren't always available, and you'll find somebody, right, who will do it. So I think it's important to know that when you get asked, you can say no. And you don't even have to have a great reason. You could just say, I'm not available, like, and they'll move on to try to find somebody else. So just important to keep in mind, like just because someone asks you is not an automatic, like I have to say yes to this and suddenly figure it all out, right? Like you can suss out a little bit, like what's going on here and whether you feel like you can handle this. Because if you can't, like you don't want to get involved. Like I don't want to sound cynical, but weddings are a lot of work, and it's important that they're done right. So if you don't feel like you can put the time and energy to do it right based on the particular situation, it's probably best not to do it, in my opinion. You're not missing out on some wonderful experience, is all I can say. Like, I mean, if you've been to weddings, like if you've had a kibbutz at a wedding, right? Like you know what weddings are. And then this third point here, just as we sort of get the ball rolling here, determining compensation. So this is like, again, I don't know how many of you in what role you'll be doing this, but if you're going to do a wedding, it's a lot of work and you should probably be paid. The amount just like varies again tremendously. If you're going to be the Masader Kedushin, like you should, even if like it's like relatively easy, you probably shouldn't take less than $500. And if you're if it's like involved, I mean, you could charge thousands or thousand or more. I mean, especially if you're traveling for it. I don't know. I mean, again, like most of my weddings were like shul people or people connected to me, so I was not charging a lot of money. No matter how much you charge, if you're like seriously involved in this, it's not worth your time. Meaning you're not getting, no amount of compensation is going to justify the amount of hours you might have to spend on this, especially when you factor in like the wedding is usually a day of your time anyway, in the midst of what's often like a busy schedule that you're trying to do things. So again, I have no idea what, again, I'm thinking America. In Israel, it's a whole different story, but like, those numbers I think are, relatively appropriate. Rabbi, do you want to say anything about compensation? Because it's something that I try to avoid, but I also know if you're doing it and you're not being paid properly, it will make you resentful, and that's a problem too.
Good. Well, I think I never took money from a student, never talk, and I didn't from students. From congregants, it was hard to do that for me, and I didn't want to, and I didn't take. And there's plenty of other people who wanted, because despite how I decry making a great show of things, I made a pretty good show. And so, and in that case, there's two factors. They actually don't in America. And I found this, even though I only did Orthodox weddings, but I found that from Reform, Conservative, and they don't respect you unless you are properly compensated.
Yes, I think that is absolutely.
It's just a fact. You're doing them a favor in the sense they felt they paid for it. Of course. Do you end up doing many for free? Do you actually end up giving from your synagogue fund to people? Of course. But in the case when it's someone who is used to spending a lot of money, okay. So I'm saying, and how do you know what to do? You talk to your colleagues, and they will tell you, and they will tell you about. But one thing, unless the people are poor, you're giving them from your stucco fund, don't take a hit on a wedding. That's a big mistake. They pay, I just had this right now. I said, you have to get me to the wedding. I mean, you just have to get me there. I'm not charging anything, but you have to get me there. You have to put me up in a proper place. When I say proper, don't mean equivalent of King David, but you know what a proper place is. And you know what? It works out better that way. It just works out better. I'm done with the part now.
No, I think that's.
Can I just ask a question?
Yeah, please.
Just regarding this whole issue of compensation and stuff, have you ever had an experience where you've asked and it's got uncomfortable? So, they're saying, well, it's a religious duty. Why are you charging me for something which is, like a religious? I know you said there's a huge amount of work involved. What I'm saying is, does it tend to make the conversation difficult?
Not at all.
Not at all.
You have the moment. I'm sorry. You have the moment of explaining to them something about life, which is a wonderful thing. I have this opportunity to do this freely for many people who can't afford.
Right.
And if that's your situation, that you can't afford, then we can discuss it. But thank God, you might be in a position that you take care of your responsibilities.
Look, the first wedding I did not ask for compensation, and this was a well-off family, and they weren't even members of my shul, though I knew the kala from like rabbinic work I was doing. It was a very involved both the prep and then the wedding itself. And it was not good that I didn't ask for money, mostly because, as Rev Landy said, when they're already shelling out tens and tens of thousands of dollars for a wedding, for them not to pay the rabbi at all sends a terrible message, because because in their own thinking, because then it's not that they take you for granted and Nebuch, they're taking the rabbi for granted. Like, it actually then hurts your ability to kind of like do things, because they're not taking you seriously with the way they need to for this process to work, effectively. So it just from that level, it becomes significant.
Yeah.
In terms of the, again, before the wedding, before we're even getting to the day of, right? Look, there's two major halachic issues that come out of this. like number one is like, can this couple be married? And it's not such an obvious question that they can be. And number two is just ensuring that the wedding is done properly. So the first, I mean, that's really it, right? And when we talk about the wedding being done properly, right? Forget, I mean, if we boil it down, it means Kedushin was done properly with proper Eidim. It means that the Ketubah was done properly with proper Eidim. And that's basically it, right? Like those are the things that are ultimately the most, the essential dimensions of it. But this question of can they be, and we'll get into that in a bit, but this question of can they be married is kind of a sensitive question, right? As you saw before in the Shulchan Aruch, right? The concern is people who don't know what they're doing are going to marry people that shouldn't be married. And that happens. It happens more than you might think. Not so much for like young people who it's pretty clear they've never been married and it's unlikely they're, mamzerim or, again, if the husband's a Kohen, that's a different ballgame, right? If the husband's a Kohen, that opens up a whole bunch of doors and you have to decide if and how and when you want to go through them. But in general, you still got to kind of assess, like, can this couple be married? Were they married before? Are they single? Is the husband a Kohen? If so, then that opens the doors, whether or not she might be a Zona or whatever. I mean, all sorts of, is she a Gior and all that kind of stuff. So we're not going to spend time on that, but like you do need to assess on some level. And it can be difficult because if you don't really know them, you want to be sensitive to this. That's where having an intake form, which I didn't even bring here, but like, an intake form in which you ask them about like, have you been married before? What's this, your parents, some of that stuff to try to, get out of like, whether there's an issue. It's not that you need to dig and be detectives, but part of the problem is if you don't try to do at least some digging and then you find out later on, it becomes much harder to deal with. So I don't know, Rav Lenny, if you have, I mean, I know you've done more weddings for people who might have issues. How do you generally, do you just say there's a chazaka, I don't care, I'm going to trust there's no problems here? Or do you feel you need to dig on some level at the initial stage just to make sure?
I say, or I try to remember to say at the very beginning that I take doing a wedding as a spiritual and want this to be spiritually correct for you, and as a religious legal act. And therefore, if you want me to do the wedding, I must abide by this, referring to the religious legal, and I will ask you questions and we'll come to the best determination possible. And but then, also it depends where you are and how you're doing it, but you kind of define yourself in this regard. People ask me then often at that point, so what kind of things? And I said, well, there's all sorts of, it can be all sorts of issues. Let's just talk. If you're really interested in me doing the wedding, let's just talk what your situation is. Now, once you've taken upon yourself to do a wedding, if there's a legal issue, then if they're still interested in making sure everything is all right, then you gotta be with them throughout the whole thing. Whether it means that it's appropriate at the time of asking a question of someone who really knows their stuff, or it's a question even of a dating issue, you have to be there. If it's an issue of, the husband, do I really have to go back and give a get to my ex that was, 20 years ago? And you say yes, then you have to be there and help through the situation. No payment. It doesn't matter if you're getting paid or not getting paid for this. You've really entered the rabbit in doing this. Now, the good news through all this is that often it's extraordinarily healing. A couple that never really had a get, often it's very healing for that process to take place. But once you've committed yourself to do a wedding, or on that basis, and they're traveling with you, then you have to be there for them.
Right. I mean, the bigger issue besides Psulei Chitun is probably going to be just, are they Jewish or not? That's, I think, probably going to be the more common problem you'll have to deal with. And again, I mean, I don't know what framework you'll be functioning in, but you'll inevitably do some digging as you talk to the couple, and you're going to have to assess quickly whether there's a real issue there or not. So that major halacha issues can they be married? Are they Jewish? And then ensuring the wedding is done properly. But we'll talk about that. In terms of the pastoral dimension here, and again, I come from the point where most of the weddings I was doing, like the people lived in my, even if they weren't members of my shul, they lived in my community. So there was an opportunity to spend significant time with them before the wedding. And I often felt a responsibility to do that because, as Rav said, like once you're saying yes to this, I don't really think it's great to say yes halfway, right? Like if you're the rabbi, you've got a responsibility here. And so, there's a pastoral dimension of the premarital piece that's, I think, very, very important. And we'll go through some of it. But what I'll just say at the very least, your job is not to solve like couples' problems, right? Your job is not, I don't think any of you have any pastoral counseling or therapeutic background. Maybe you do, I don't know. But even if you do, then you know that in the short time between when you start this process and the wedding itself, you're not going to solve problems. So the orientation you should have from a pastoral perspective is not solving problems, but identifying problems and potentially raising them with the couple, right? Like, I see this might be a problem, or have you thought about this? And then you see how they relate to it. I don't know if again, there are rabbis who will sort of like, if they really see a train wreck coming, they'll say like, I'm not going to do this wedding. I sort of had a situation that came close to that, but then the couple ended up breaking it off anyway, thank God, because it made my life a lot easier than having to just say like, you guys shouldn't be married. But again, the pastoral dimension is like, are there serious problems here that aren't being addressed? And it's the rabbi's role to raise them. And then again, if depending on how that plays out, you may have to say no. I never said no. Rav Landis, you probably did at some point. Can you give an example where you were in it? You're like, I can't do this. This shouldn't happen. Not from Allah, just from what you were seeing.
A more simple case is I ended up making a policy of not doing a second wedding for someone who I did the first wedding for.
Yeah.
I said, just help them find someone else. I also, after a short period of being a rabbi, determined, in Los Angeles had, but I think now in many cities there's plenty of pre-couple modalities for counseling, and basically, I asked. It's kind of crazy. In the Orthodox world, it seemed kind of nuts. I asked them all to go into a pre-couple situation. Most did. I really did not know how one does the reportage on that. And I left doing that at 45. So I hadn't really gotten to the full wisdom, but it was quite helpful. And, it's quite helpful, especially if you're coming from a background like me. I think everyone should be in therapy for at least for a while. So, have some self-reflection. There's not a bad place, but it's not a cure-all.
Right. No, I agree. Look, I know rabbis that mandate as part of it, you got to meet with a therapist. And then one of the rabbis I know actually has the therapist report back. Again, confidentially, not like, gross details, but just, whatever is necessary for him to feel like he can do this should go forward. We'll see in a moment. Look, yeah.
Because the greatest suffix always had is what makes a good shidduch. In the end, you have to have some humility. Some marriages have worked that I never would have given it, a real chance. And the perfect marriages we all know about that fall apart.
Yeah, look, it's tough. Sometimes you do this and like there's not even like friction, but you have a strong sense this marriage is not going to last. Like I've had at least a couple like that where they weren't even like fighting, but like it just didn't seem likely this was going to work. It's a tough place to be in, when you with this and you do this long enough, you start like Rav said, the people you've married then become divorced and then come back to you. And it's just sad. Like it's a tough place to be in for people. So like like I said, these things are weighty matters. Gary, you have a hand? Do you have a question?
Yeah, sorry for interrupting again. Just wondered, like you're doing all the pre-prep for a wedding, and let's say they both give their addresses on some paperwork, and you realize they're living in the same place. And these little issues are halakhically could raise a problem, might not raise a problem. But do you just skirt around it, or do you say, well, hold on, that raises the problem?
So no, that's fine. So the general approach is we don't. in most Orthodox, non-Orthodox circles is like, we'll do weddings for couples that are living together and not and couples that will not necessarily keep Taharat Mishpacha. That's, I would say, relatively standard practice. I mean, look, Sri Aish has a tshuva about this. Like it's been standard practice for a relatively long time. Look, Chatan and Kala classes. Somebody needs to do them. So the question becomes: is it you and your Rebbitzin? If there is a Rebbitzin, do you farm them out to somebody else? I think women should be learning with women. So it's helpful to know somebody people that you can recommend to potentially take on that role as a Kala class. I didn't bring the Chatan curriculum. I mean, I have stuff. I mean, I don't know if you want me to send it to you, but it's not these topics. It's all Nita's stuff. But like, again, like you should, oftentimes people will want this. And even people who aren't from may want this. Like you can still offer it. And then there's another question about like, how much, even if they're not going to keep Taharat Mishpacha at all, you're not doing Chatan and Kala classes, you still can feel comfortable suggesting the idea of going to the mikveh for the woman. I mean, there are plenty of women who will go to the mikveh before marriage, even if they're never going to do keep Taharat Mishpacha. And then even for that, right? Like in terms of the preparations they would need to go to the mikveh, it's, just tell them to clean themselves thoroughly and make sure it's after their, their period's over. And, that's good enough for that, for that context. In terms of like,
I would add, first of all, on this, I was firmer. I would mandate that everyone needed to go to the mikveh. I would suggest, again, as a shul rabbi, I haven't been a shul rabbi in 25 years, but in those days, I suggest that the man would also go to the mikveh. And in the few weddings I do now periodically, I more or less mandated as well. And I have a shomer go with the man. It's the second thing that I do, and that, of course, for many reasons, fits into the temper of the times. But I've also had enough chutzpah to talk about one of the weakest things in tradition, which is separation for a week, which now I say that's a good thing. I think it'd be good for separation. You're very used to each other. You have an intimate relationship. There's no problem talking about this. No one's embarrassed. But but I think you'll find, in other words, I'm very daring about it. I think you will find, but I'm daring about it because I actually believe it, is that if you're separate for a week, it might be a really great thing. No, I haven't lost anybody during the way. Sometimes one could worry about that. But that's my suggestion.
Well, I'll say this. I mean, once you start getting into Taharat Mishpacha, like related issues, you need to have kind of a bit more of a relationship with them to kind of scaffold that, because it gets kind of complicated quickly. So it's harder to do that for somebody that's just sort of like coming off the street, so to speak. But I mean, it can be very, very worthwhile when done properly. It also depends, is this person on a journey versus is this person just need a rabbi to do the wedding and they like you and you like them and you're happy to do it. Those are two separate, situations entirely. So a lot of this depends on context, but what has to be kept in mind is that